And you know we serve an awesome God, a great God. Come on and put your hands together. Hey. Say sing we just take this moment and we bless
Truly,
you
and I
right
just want
in
to
the
greet everybody with Jesus joy. It is just such an honor and a pleasure. And I'm sure everybody, especially at 8 o'clock in the morning, is probably tired of Zoomtopia, or maybe it's Zoom dystopia, and can't wait for this thing to get over so we can enjoy fellowship one with another in person. But, I just want to thank Healing Communities, especially Dr. Strothers, Dr. Trulier, and just so many others that have poured into my life and for giving me this opportunity. And so because I was trained in the Baptist tradition, I can go long. So I'm just going to stop there, because if I start calling out names, I'll probably be doing that all morning. I think we are in business. Great. And so this is called R.E.A.L Prison Ministry Leads People to Whole Lives. And I'm just going to share a little bit of background, because you'll notice that the R.E.A.L is an acronym and W.H.O.L.E is an acronym. And you'll also notice that I started with a prison cell. You may wonder, if we're talking about reentry, why we're starting with a prison cell. Many years ago, a chaplain from New York State in the 60s said that reentry doesn't begin when somebody walks out, but it begins at the very beginning when somebody enters the justice system. And one of the things I learned when I got out of prison 9 years ago and went back to Albany, New York, it was at a time when the Second Chance Act had just been defunded, because it was after the crash of 2008. We were in the Great Recession. A lot of programs had changed, and there was a discontinuity between the ministry that people were doing on the inside and the programs on the inside with the reality of the programs on the outside. So there was this junction between what I was doing inside, and it didn't translate to help to really providing a landing pad for me when I got out. So there was a disconnect between what was going on inside in the prison, what's going on outside in the community. And so this workshop is set up as a case study that kind of looks at the work Emory Fellowship engages in to help people who are justice impacted to experience to lead whole lives. Emory Fellowship is a United Methodist fellowship. The Lord brought me in kicking and screaming. And and I met my pastor, and just like when you meet your pastor, the church comes along with it. And so Emory is situated in the Brightwood section of the District of Columbia, and that's going to be key in a minute when we're looking at assessing the context for thinking about reentry. So we're going to discuss, first and foremost, just a biblical narrative that I see that provides insight into reentry dynamics and the concepts of R.E.A.L and W.H.O.L.E as it relates to prison ministry and reentry. This workshop is going to seek to present a vision of what's possible when the church takes a holistic approach to prison ministry and reentry. This workshop will also outline at the very end, very briefly, through collaborative conversations, hopefully with you all, based on conversations based on identifying resources within the church, organizational, and local context. And we're going to do all of that in the next, 30, 40 minutes. So this was me. I was arrested 20 years ago. I grew up in Albany, New York, and moved to the South Bronx at the height of the crack era. I don't know, me and a friend of mine were talking some time ago, and he didn't see it this way, but me getting all this, having more degrees in the thermometer, way too educated, said to him, have you noticed that all of us, everybody we know has some felony conviction? And it just blew his mind. He had never thought of it that way. We thought that almost everybody we know, I don't know anybody that I knew from the South Bronx or that was within my circle that didn't have some connection to the justice system, either through being incarcerated or having a direct family member that was incarcerated. And Michelle Alexander kind of links this out where she gives statistics about the number of people in particular neighborhoods that are justice impacted. And so this was one of the cells I was in. This is the infamous Sing Sing prison. This is A block. I had a chance to spend a number of years there. It was in this place where, it was in this space that I first walked into the wrong section of the chapel building In 2001, I was a year into my sentence. The only thing I knew about prison was that it was going to be a rough, number one, it's going to be a rough place, because a lot of people had told me that a lot of the programs had ended, and we know college programs had ended. I didn't know why. Now we know that because of the 1994 crime bill, which was signed into law by our, well, I don't want to say a good friend, but Bill Clinton. And also this bill is attached to, and he's had to answer for it to current vice president, our presidential candidate, Joe Biden. And one of the stipulations, outside of the many stipulations, was that, or provisions inside of the bill, was that it ended higher education in prison almost overnight. There were over 300 college programs over 300 college programs, I think, in over 1,200 facilities around the country, and it went down to 8 within like a year or two. And so when I got to prison in New York, there was one program left. It was offered by New York Theological Seminary, and it was in this infamous Sing Sing prison. And so I thought God was playing a trick on me, because I had an experience with the risen Christ inside of a jail cell not too long before that. And so when I walked into the wrong section of the chapel building looking for transitional services and ended up in the NYTS master's classroom, I'm saying, God, why are you showing me a master's degree when there's no bachelor's degree program? There's no, and I didn't have 4 transferable credits to my name. Eventually, God sent me to Eastern Correctional Facility, and 2 things happened. Number one, the church, the prison was the only prison in the state at the time that had Bible study as a paid program. Inside of prison, you have to work at least 2 or 3 modules, meaning that you work a morning module, a combination of either a morning, afternoon, or evening module, and there are 3 3-hour modules throughout the day. And you had Bible study as a paid program. And so I was doing Bible study, but it also had Bard College. Bard College had just started. They weren't offering degrees. Maybe some people have heard of their recent documentary that's getting national and international acclaim, College Behind Bars. They didn't know what kind of the program that looks so structured today was growing organic at the time. They were thinking, they hadn't had a graduation yet. They didn't know if they were going to be able to offer a BA program. It grew into what it is today fairly organically. I was very fortunate to get in 2004, and it was in a space like this that God first began to allow me to dream in the middle of a nightmare. And so it was also in this space that where it comes to the reentry narrative. This is a reentry narrative that I'm sure some people aren't, maybe if you've read this passage or gone over it before or heard this story, it doesn't always sound like, it doesn't seem like it's a reentry narrative, but it's in 2 Kings, and it's the life of Manasseh. And King Manasseh, and I'll just read a couple verses, so I don't want to trouble your patience too long with this. But in 2 Kings 21 and also in 2 Chronicles 33, we find the life of Manasseh. And at the very beginning of 2 Kings 21, and there's a key distinction between the 2 texts that kind of lifts up a reentry narrative. I think that applies to our context. Hopefully it will bless you. Number one, the first verse is, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 50 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the abominable practices of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And then down to 16, I didn't want to trouble you with all of the verses in between, but it basically lays out all the charges and describes what it meant by he did evil in the sight of the Lord. It lists all these negative things that he had done. And the things that he had done not just impacted him, but had actually destroyed people's lives. And it's almost like a list of charges, like a rap sheet that tells you all the bad things that he does, and is kind of describing his life. And then it says at the very end, moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood until he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, besides the sin that he caused Judah to sin, so that they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh, all that he did and the sin that he committed, are they not written in the book of the annals of the king of Judah? Manasseh slept with his ancestors, and he was buried in the garden of his house. In the garden of Uzzah, his son, Amon, succeeded him. You may say, preacher and reverend, what does this have to do with reentry? Well, here's his story. And it's kind of like the story that I put forward when I showed the picture of when I was arrested. My mother actually kept that. All the years that I was in for 11 and a half years, she kept it sitting next to where she sat and watched TV every day. I found it under one of her this dish thing that she had on her on the stand where she would watch TV. So I could imagine her sitting there and crying and reading it every night, probably blaming herself, wondering what was going on. How did things turn out this way? Dealing with guilt and shame that never got processed is another thing in terms of family dynamics. Many times ministry and reentry, we're thinking of reentry in terms of just a person coming home, but the family needs ministry as well, and many times has internalized their own guilt and shame and feelings of anger as well. I was the son that my mother loved, and I was also the source of much of her pain, and how she had to reconcile that. And as I've talked with hundreds of family members, they've had to reconcile those same types of tensions that don't get resolved inside of when people are in prison. Because number one, nobody wants to fight on when you have 4 hours of a visit. The last thing you want to do is use your emotional energy to fight. The last thing you want to do on a 15-minute call is to use your emotional energy to fight. So many times those conversations are sanitized, and we really don't deep dive into issues and deal with some of the emotional trauma that people on the inside are feeling and families on the outside are feeling. And many people on the outside don't feel that they have safe spaces by which to process a lot of this emotional trauma. And so here's Manasseh, and notice that it ends with a period, and so it lays out all the negative aspects of his life. But then something switches when we get to 2 Chronicles. 2 Kings ends with Manasseh, almost like the picture that I showed you of that story ended with a period inside of that newspaper. Manasseh's story ends with a period. It says he destroys his community. There's blood in the streets, and it seems like it's over. 2 Chronicles gives us a different perspective. And for those of us that have been to seminary or cemetery, decide what you call it, we realize that there's different perspectives. That 2 Kings is written from one perspective, 2 Chronicles is written from another perspective. I won't go too far into the divided kingdoms and which kingdom is actually writing the story, but I'll just say that there's two different perspectives of the kings being written here. And in 2 Chronicles, it gives you all the negative stuff that we see in 2 Kings, but then it says something else. And in verse 10, it says, the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they gave no heed. Therefore, the Lord brought against them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh captive in manacles, bound him with fetters, and brought him to Babylon, meaning that they sent him to prison. And so we would want to ask, though, for those of us that understand that Assyria, their capital was Nineveh, and so you would ask, why is Manasseh going to Babylon when the Assyrians hadn't taken over, the Chaldeans hadn't taken over Babylon yet? And so you can imagine that this is being written at a time most likely when the children of Israel are in exile, and they're in Babylonian exile years after these events happen, and they're reflecting on the promise of God that God would always, always have a Davidic king sitting on his throne. And that there's a hope and there's a promise from the prophet Isaiah and others that they're holding on to this hope that at some point they're going to return back to their community. And here is a king that kind of encapsulates the worst of Israel's existence. That he's kind of the model of all the quote unquote sins that Israel's committed, and for the reasons why the prophets say that they're languishing now in captivity. And he kind of represents the worst of the worst. And if God could do something for him, which we're going to see in a minute, then God would do it for them as well. And so I actually reason why I bring this up is 9 years into my sentence, when I still had 3 years left, the law changed after that, and I got out 6 months early. That was divine. That was miraculous in and of itself. But we were sitting in a chapel building watching one of those old Billy Graham movies. Don't ask me why the chaplain had those things going. But anyway, and in the middle of the movie, Billy Graham comes on and preaches. Normally he preaches at the end of those movies. In the middle, he starts talking, he brings up Manasseh, and I decided to go back and look at these verses again. I don't remember why, but I just remembered, why don't I go back to these verses? And I'd never noticed a distinction between 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles before. And so after all of this, after he's in prison, it says, while he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord, his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. He prayed to him and received his entreaty, heard his plea, and restored him again to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord indeed was God. Afterward, he built an outer wall for the city of David, west of Gihon in the valley, reaching the entrance at the fish gate. He carried it around Ophel and raised it to a very great height. He also put commanders of the army in all the fortified cities in Judah. He took away the foreign gods and the idol from the house of the Lord and all the altars that he built on the mountain of the house of the Lord and in Jerusalem, and he threw them out of the city. He also restored the altar of the Lord and offered it on sacrifices of well-being and of thanksgiving, and he commanded Judah to serve the Lord God of Israel. Here is someone who was in prison for murder and a number of other charges. And he has an encounter with God inside of prison. God puts him back on the throne, sends him back to the community he destroyed. And I remember I felt like the Spirit of God was telling me, because I was gonna run from New York. I was gonna go to live with my family in Florida. And God felt that the Spirit was telling me, no, you need to go back to that same place that you help people to get on drugs, that you robbed 5 banks. How are you going to take all your education and run from the city that you helped to destroy? And so I felt that this story was telling me to go back to my community, and that's what I did. And I served as a chaplain. I was a chaplain's aide for 8 years in prison, and my first job out of a prison was 10 hours a week for $10 an hour, and I love that to this day. Don't tell Vera, it's my favorite job I ever had, because I got a chance to minister to people in their brokenness, who were homeless, who were dealing with addiction, people just like me. I got to minister to them in their most broken place, because I knew what it was like to be in a space of hopelessness and move to a space of hopefulness, and that's what characterized my ministry there. From there, I also worked with the same DA's office that sentenced me on youth program development. And then eventually I went to Yale. But I want to make one more point, and then I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on from this. There's something that's absent from this text, is that remember what 2 Kings tells us, is that his life ends with a period. And it says that he shed so much innocent blood. And here he is now coming back as king, as the leader of the community, and he leads the people into worship. He leads a spiritual revival and also community redevelopment. He strengthens his community. How would the people who were ill affected by his action, the family members of whose blood is still in the street, how are they supposed to receive him back? How would they have felt having to go into worship with him and have him as their leader? And so God showed me that sometimes in many of these texts, and also in our lives and in the celebration stories of transformation stories of people that come home and seemingly do well, that sometimes it can silence the very hurt and the pain that we've caused. And so I know, I'm very cognizant that my story, my jail to Yale story, comes at the expense of a lot of people's pain. And while I can't, and many of us that are returning citizens are struggling with that. We're struggling with trying to be the people that we are today, but there's also seems to be constant reminders of who we were before. And many times we see that hurt and our pain in our families and broken relationships. For example, I married my son's mother after not talking to her for 18 years. My son was my best man at our wedding when he was 22 years old. I didn't see him from the time he was 3 until he was 21, but my daughter still wants nothing to do with me. And so having to resolve a lot of that tension and pain is very difficult, especially if you don't have safe spaces on the outside where you can be vulnerable. And prison is a space that forces you to be invulnerable, and that the ways of being and living inside of prison are specifically antithetical, or the ways of surviving in prison are antithetical to the ways for thriving inside of society. And so breaking some of those barriers, and I'll get to this point now, is that the physical transition from prison to society took about 3 minutes just to walk out of the prison. The psychological transition takes a lifetime. 9 years out, I'm still unearthing the ways I've internalized that prison experience. 9 years into it. And at many times it's been the pastors in my life, the men and women of God in my life, and those that ministered to me inside of the prison that have been the conversation partners, that have been the people that God has used to a path of healing and wholeness inside of my life. And so Manasseh comes back, and I want us to hold that there. And sometimes people have two stories in their lives. There's one that ends, some people Our brothers and sisters in prison, to some extent, have that Second Kings moment where it seems like it ends with a period, like your life is over. But then something can happen inside of prison where they have an encounter with God that radically transforms their lives. They come back to society with renewed purpose, but also realizing the deep pain and hurt that we've caused. And so this is my second Chronicles moment. As mentioned, this was my Jail to Yale article that came out. I went to Yale not even 2 years out of prison. And when I got out in 2011, because the Second Chance Act had been gutted, almost every program closed in Albany. So I did not take advantage, or I didn't really have any reentry programs to work with. The one reentry program I went to, the person that was my case manager was sitting across from my desk a year later at the rescue mission asking me for a job. And so that just, isn't that ironic? And so when I went to Yale, the only thing I knew how to be, if you think about it, my only experience of being an adult, because I started getting arrested from the time I was 18 all the way. So basically from 18 to 37 until I got out of prison, I was in and out of jail, just living a life that was crazy. And now here I am with all this education, but still with, I really didn't have a lot of experience of being a man in the world in the way that I wanted to now when I got out of prison at 37. And so I went to Yale, and you can imagine going from a place like Sing Sing that I showed you just a few minutes ago to a place like Yale. Obviously, it's a completely different world. And the one thing I knew how to be in the church. Inside of prison, I knew how to be a student. And so I used those two roles as my way of being, as a way to navigate the relationships that I had to, work through post-prison. Eventually I got it, after working at, after finishing my degree, I went to the Georgetown University Pivot Program, and I see I need to move on. Georgetown University started a first of its kind reentry program, where they offer a certificate in business fundamentals and entrepreneurship to formerly incarcerated DC residents. That's critical, because we're going to look at assessing the context in terms of some strategies, and we're going to look at the DC context that kind of informs the work that we do, not only at Pivot, but also the work that we did, that I did with Pivot, but the work that we're doing with Emory. And so the Pivot program is run, you need three things in order to have a Pivot, at least. You need a business school, so you can have faculty that can provide the courses, and the courses were provided were in business fundamentals, entrepreneurship, and also the liberal arts. So for example, courses like economics, business communications, difficult conversations, logic, and other courses like that. And then the second part is you need to have a city that has a workforce development program. DC has Project Empowerment. That's the workforce development program. They provide a $10 an hour, but especially in DC, you can't live on $10 an hour. It's hard living on $100 an hour, but it's difficult living on $10 an hour. So Georgetown provides a $5 extra stipend, so it's roughly around $15 that our fellows make, and they're able to go into internships. They're able to have internships throughout the city. So one of the things that the business school does is tries to leverage its relationships with local businesses and place people inside these internships for two things. Number one, to provide skill development for our returning citizens and our Pivot Fellows that we call Pivot Fellows. And number two, to help change the employer mindset around hiring returning citizens. And just like we believe in evangelism, people go out into the world and they preach and teach the gospel of Jesus, who is a revolutionary Christ. So we want, when our interns have they have great experiences with our fellows, because they're super sharp, way smarter than me. They just don't have, many times people just don't have the opportunities I had. I mean, I left people in prison way, way, way smarter, greater drive and determination. They just didn't have access to the opportunities I had. And I always wonder, what kind of drives my heart for this work is, I know what the opportunities did for me, and I wonder what other how it could transform other people's lives if they just had access to these same opportunities. So real quick, for example, BAR took 15 people each year out of a prison system of 70,000. So for every one person that gets in every year, almost 5,000 can. And so how can we bring that to scale? And that's some of the work I'm doing at Vera that I'll talk about in a second. And so the first prong is you have a business school. Second, you have a workforce development program, but that's two-pronged as well. So you have, that's providing a wage on the first part. And 1 second. Okay. There's people waiting in the waiting room.
Yes.
Okay. How can I get them into what? Just tell me what I need to do.
You can, if you click on participants.
Got it.
And then you should see those that are waiting.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Admit.
Yes. Admit all.
Okay.
There you go. Thank you.
Is everybody else? Everybody's in?
I gave you host privileges, so
got
you
it.
have to take care of it.
Okay. Yeah, if you see it, just stop me.
Okay.
Because I may be moved. My mind may be moving, so please just feel free to stop me. Anybody else, if they have any questions as well. We're going to get to Q&A in a second. I want to do it like a halftime show thing here. So, and then the third prong for pivot, well, actually, the second prong is you want to have a workforce development program, but also businesses in the community that will hire interns, and it's free for them. So we take care of paying for them, and also we provide laptops, as well as all the books. So it's a completely paid for program, and we pay our pivot fellows. It's no cost to the pivot fellows at all, or to the internships as well. But we do pay our professors, and they pay pretty well. The third is, actually, no, excuse me. That is a third, the internships. And so it's, if you think about it, it's the business school, the workforce development, and the internships. And we can talk about that in a minute if you want. Next is my work at Vera. So the Vera Institute has been around, I believe, since the 60s or maybe early 70s. And so I work in, and these are the three kind of areas that we're committed to: securing justice, ending mass incarceration, and strengthening families and communities. I work in the federal policy team. So I spend my days mainly virtually on Capitol Hill, trying to lobby and managing a national team of consultants and staff to restore Pell Grant eligibility for people who are incarcerated. And so right now, if you think of our prison system at 2.3 million, it's actually, that population is bigger than the states of Alaska, Wyoming, and Vermont combined. It would be, I think, the 4th or 5th largest city. And if outside of county jails, with people in state and federal facilities are around 1.5 million. And so now they don't have access to Pell Grants. And so higher education opportunities are limited. Without going too far, here we go, I can admit this person. Without going too far into that, I will say that after 25 years, we were able to get Pell restoration for all people who are incarcerated, no carve-outs, into the House Appropriations Bill that passed back in July. Unfortunately, Chairman Shelby and Ranking Member Leahy in the Senate can't get on the same page. So the Senate hasn't put forward any appropriations bills, as we've seen from not being able to do anything with HEROES. They haven't put up they haven't really put up too much activity inside of the Senate. So we're still waiting on the appropriations process, but we're looking at other vehicles to get Pell restoration back. There is a silver lining. Back in 2015, the Obama administration started a second chance Pell. We call it SCP, Second Chance Pell Pilot Program, that allowed 62 or 63 colleges to offer college programming as a part of a pilot program. Under the current administration, you know, they have to, if one person does something right, it seems like they have to do more. They created, they expanded it, they doubled the number. And so I think it's around 130 second chance Pell sites. And so we're of the mindset though, instead of just expanding second chance Pell, why not just pass Pell, have it come back? We know that, for example, at Bard College, 97.5% of the people don't go back to prison, compared to almost 83% for every other program that we're spending billions and billions of dollars on. So that's my work at Vera. while I was meditating on the Manasseh story, something came to me. I said, you know, Lord, if you ever get me out of here, because I knew too many people that died inside of prison. And I knew that it wasn't a given that I was ever going to get out. I thought of R.E.A.L prison ministry, redemption, education, accountability, and love. And so you can imagine my surprise when I met Reverend Dr. Joseph Daniels, who is the pastor of Emory Fellowship, and their mission and vision statement, or for ministry, mission statement for ministry, is also real. It's relevant, enthusiastic, authentic, and loving. And so I thought, you know, is this God telling me that this is the church I'm supposed to partner with to bring about R.E.A.L? And so here's why we need this type of ministry. Here's why we're doing what we're doing. And here's why Pivot is doing what it's doing. Here's the context in which we are in here in, oh, I see that. Do we have more people that need to come in? Okay. Here's the context we are in DC. There are 6,000 DC residents in federal prisons, 2,000 in local jails. But look at the number on probation and parole. That's just about, what, 9,600 people. That's roughly, I think, over 2%. But if you think of the majority of the people come from basically 3 wards in DC. And so if you think of the number of people that you have to service inside of your community, it's a daunting picture. And so with almost 10,000 people on probation and parole, not to mention the people pouring back in from local jails, DC has a challenge in terms of making sure that returning citizens have access to services and thrive in society post-incarceration. In terms of the incarceration rates, the District of Columbia, and by incarceration rates, it's per capita, so it's per 100,000. The United States is at 698 per 100,000. The District of Columbia is at 1,153. I think we're second or third in the country. Maybe Oklahoma or Louisiana is number 1. But we're either 2 or 3, I believe. But if you'll notice that the incarceration rate for DC is more than basically all the NATO countries, which I put down, the United Kingdom and everybody else, than all those countries combined. Just let that sink in. I mean, that's crazy. Mm. The national recidivism rate, I call it a national crisis. The National Institute of Justice says 75% are rearrested over 5 years. The BJS report says 83% in 9 years. And for a number of years, the marker was 5 years. They looked at people after the first year. There's a first year marker. How many people went back within the first year? How many went back within 3 years? How many went back within 5 years? And obviously defining recidivism, that's one thing maybe the field, if there's any political scientists or on here or sociologists or statisticians, there's no one definition for what recidivism is. Is recidivism just being rearrested? Is it being rearrested and not just going back to jail? Is it being rearrested and actually being reconvicted? Do we count people that go back for parole violations that aren't actually a crime? For example, like if you're out past 8 o'clock and it's 8:30 and your parole officer decides to lock you up, you haven't committed any crime, but you've definitely violated your parole. So does that count as recidivism? So you can see how this number, how even some of these numbers really don't tell, and Khalil Gibran Muhammad talks about this very well, is that statistics only tell us one part of the picture, that there's a much deeper story, because statistics are just numerical representations of reality. And so in DC, the recidivism rate, however we want to define it, is at 60%. And regardless of how we define it, I mean, that number is astronomical. I graduated from Yale and now I'm going to Georgetown. Could you imagine if 60% of the students at Yale were flunking out or were leaving the school? They would ask, what the hell is going on? Excuse me, what the heaven is going on with, I get passionate about this, is going on with the students, but they're also going to ask what the blank is going on with this system, what's going on with the school. They're going to have questions of the school, not just of the individuals. It's not just an individual problem, but it seems that we lose that in the context of prisons, where we think it's just individual responsibility, and that the system that we're spending billions of dollars on has no responsibility in these recidivism rates. There's money, I believe there was a bill not that long ago where there are certain hospitals, they have, they'll lose funding if people keep coming back to the hospital, if they have high recidivism rates. And so it seems that the prison system in America is the only system that we allow that level of failure without questioning the way the system is run. And so DC has a 50% unemployment rate for its returning citizens. 89% of the people in DC prisons is Black. So this goes to Michelle Alexander's point of the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the age of color blindness. But I would also temper her work and recommend Elizabeth Hitton's work from the war on poverty to the war, I think, to the war on crime, is it? The making of mass incarceration in America, that actually takes, where Alexander is giving kind of the broad sweep of the racial injustice and the racial implications of mass incarceration and its history of disenfranchisement and racial policies that disenfranchise large swaths of its citizenry. With Elizabeth Hitton's work that kind of looks at specific policies that started in the Johnson administration, and Fujiyama Morikawa in her work, The First Civil Right, How Liberals Built Prison America, however you want to take that title. I didn't write it. She kind of chronicles something similar to the same extent, that looks at the policies of actually like the Lyndon Johnson era, and especially his R.E.A.L. That was the first time the federal government was actually sending funds to local police departments that helped to fuel kind of, number one, if you think about it in this way, if you're a locality, you have to justify why you're getting funds. So of course, arrest-only policing, if you have high crime, if you can justify that you have high crime rates, and obviously high crime rates are only the number of arrests that take place in a particular area. It doesn't really tell you how much quote unquote crime is actually happening. It's just how many arrests happen in the area. Then obviously you can get more federal funding. So it incentivizes arrest-only policing policies. Next, in DC, there are 574 collateral consequences in housing and employment and in other areas. And this comes from the recidivism rates, and some of the other rates come from the George Washington University's Roosevelt Center, but also there's something called the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction. Maybe you've already heard of that. I'm not telling you anything new, but for those that haven't, you can Google it, National Inventory of Collateral Consequences. It's a tool that if you put in like your locality, and also maybe, and there's other ways to refine your search, and you can determine exactly what happens if you have a felony conviction. You know, how are you discriminated in housing and employment and other things, and that way you can get a sense. But just in DC alone, there's 574 collateral consequences. I recommend also, you know, the state imprisonment rate. You can actually look at the Sentencing Project. They give a lot of great statistics. This can help you with assessing the context, meaning what is the recidivism rate or what is the imprisonment rate in my area? How does it compare to the national scale? So that goes into assessing the context. Next, and I realize I'm close to time here. So R.E.A.L prison ministry, I wanted to merge both aspects of R.E.A.L. So we want to make redemption relevant. We want to be enthusiastic about education. We want to be authentic we want to offer authentic accountability. We want to love God, and we want to be loving of our justice impacted neighbors. And you'll notice the twin love there also goes with the Great Commandment and its corollary. So I'm just going to skip this for a moment and just go that one of the things we wanted to do as we were assessing the context in which we live, that I just showed for what's going on in DC, we wanted to have ministry to families, workforce development, advocacy, ministry inside, and a reentry resource center. Now, obviously, that's a lot to do. But also, we looked at what is Emory already doing, and how can we expand or utilize the ministries we already do. But then also, and what Emory does is they have the Emory Beacon of Light. A few things that they're looking to do is to address the housing crisis, low-income housing crisis in DC, create a home ownership center, workforce development, and food insecurity. And so how to merge this into a holistic prison ministry / reentry framework. And so WHOLE stands for well physically, healed emotionally, obedient spiritually, loved unconditionally, empowered financially. One of the best pieces of advice that somebody gave me, they didn't realize they were giving me this advice when I came out of prison, but they just said what they were doing. And they said when they got out of prison, it was Reverend Morris Webster. He was the first preacher I ever heard when I was in jail. And he preached right after they sang the song by Kurt Franklin, with Jesus, I know I can make it. With him, I know I can stand. No matter what may come my way, my life is in his hand. That song, I never heard it again during my 11 and a half years in prison. But that song kept me through those 11 and a half years, even to this day. Man, I love that song. And so one of the greatest pieces of advice that he gave was he compartmentalized his life. He realized that he had a spiritual life. He needed help with finances, relationships, and he broke it down into these 7 categories. And he went to find agencies and people that could help mentor him in those areas. And so what we're thinking of is, well, what if we use this as a model for a holistic approach for helping people, for ministering to and with, that's a key distinction, ministering to and with people in prison, families on the outside, and also returning citizens. So what is it for people who are inside, families, for everyone impacted by, that's just as impacted, to be well physically, healed emotionally, obedient spiritually, loved unconditionally, empowered financially. And so the first thing we wanted to do was, we have at Emory a wellness ministry. We also have housing. We also have a food pantry. The three key indicators many times of or challenges that people coming home from prison have is housing, housing and employment, those 2 things, but also food insecurity. Many areas inside of our cities are food deserts, and so we wanted to address food insecurity inside of our area. Now, the next is to be healed emotionally. So one of the things we have is we have our Stevens ministry on the outside, and that provides some pastoral care and counseling. I believe we have a hotline as well that people can call and receive support. And now we want to hopefully expand that to help families on the outside that are struggling with incarceration. One of the things I noticed in all the places that I've shared my testimony and preached, specifically in historically Black churches context, is whenever I would talk with someone, if they wanted to talk to me about that they had a family member who was incarcerated, they would talk real low. It's funny how they would come as close as they could to me and say, you know, my husband's in prison, my son's in prison, my daughter's in prison, as if nobody else in the congregation knew that. Almost, you know how nosy we are in church, and when everybody knows that the person's in prison, and yet the person still feels that level of guilt and shame that they can't speak, so as if other people can hear, that they have to whisper it. And so many times people are inside of our organizations and sitting in our pews that are suffering in silence, sitting in the place of hope and healing, and can't be vulnerable and express some of the deep pain that they may be experiencing, and have a place to work through it. And so in terms of being well physically and healed emotionally, Emory has a Beacon Center. And so now we have the residences. So one of the things they did was they worked with the city and also with the denomination, and they created and they built around the church. They wanted the church to be the center. So they basically, you know, they redeveloped the church as well. And then they built 99 units of affordable housing around the church. So the church is at the center, and there's 99 units of affordable housing built around the church. We have a huge waiting list But we're also trying to leverage our other properties in order to be used for transitional housing and other programmings. But the center was built though with the future in mind, and so one of the things that we have.
Take the first left.
Oh, okay. We're going to have a workforce development program that goes with the empowered financially. I realize I'm just about out of time, and I want to get at least a couple questions in.
Turn left at the traffic light.
Let me move forward, and then I'll come back to that. So we have a health and wellness ministry that we want to offer to family members who are just family members of people who are incarcerated, and also people who have returned. And we also want to offer for our returning citizens. We also offer pastoral care and counseling. How and what does that look like in the context of people returning from prison? And also we want to hopefully continue to specialize it to address the needs of people that are coming home, and also to families, their incarcerated loved ones. So to be obedient spiritually and loved unconditionally, we want to have worship services inside of prison, Bible studies and support groups inside of prison, and a welcoming church home on the outside. We also want to love people unconditionally, which is the underlying ethic of the ministry, and empowered financially. So we want to have a restaurant and community kitchen incubator at the Emory Beacon of Light. So the building was built, 99 units of affordable housing, or the whole complex was built to have a couple of things. Number one, a commercial kitchen. Number two, it's going to be called Aunt Betty's Cafe, which is a restaurant that is going to specifically be a workforce development program for returning citizens.
Right at the traffic light.
So all people coming through our culinary arts program will be able to work inside of the kitchen, at our sit down in our restaurant and community kitchen, and also as an incubator, hopefully for those that want to start their own businesses, but don't have a commercial kitchen that they have access to. Many times they may not be able to provide catering services because they don't have a commercial kitchen that they could use. And so we want to offer that to people that are for startups, specifically for people that are coming home from prison. And so here's just some strategies. Number one, assess the context. We did that by looking at the recidivism rate. We wanted to know what is the situation, what does mass incarceration look like in our context? Number two, identify resources within the church. What is the church already doing that we can expand and tailor to the context of returning citizens and their families? And then explore partnerships. I didn't get to this one for lack of time, but our Emory Beacon of Light we realized, number one, we can't do it all. Jesus may have paid it all, but Jesus didn't do it all. Even he had people around him to help minister, using us today. So exploring, what are the partnerships? And first, I would say with assessing context, doing a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. What can we do? Where can we partner? What can't we do as well? Like what would extend our resources to the point to where we wouldn't be doing it effective? Would it be good for us to do something that we could have that we could do at 30% when we can partner with somebody else that can do it 100%? I noticed that with a number of different programs when I was released, that the reentry programs that got cut was because they weren't reentry programs. They were programs that were designed or had a mission statement to do other things, and decided to try to find funding for reentry. And so because reentry wasn't the thing they did whenever the cuts came, or they had to cut programs, that went well. And so because they didn't focus all of their resources in reentry, many times those programs, I think, lacked the depth to really address the
exit 14 on the right to
and also lastly,
the first left.
Empower justice impacted leaders. Notice that Manasseh comes back and he's the king. What if we looked at all of the people who are justice impacted as potential Manassehs, in the sense that they're all capable of being leaders, and that our ministry is not just to them but with them, to empower people to become justice impacted leaders. That's the way my mentors in prison saw me. They saw a leader when all I could see was a failure. And now I have the privilege of helping other people just like myself and empower them to become leaders in their families, leaders in their communities, even leaders inside of the prisons. And so with that, I thank you for allowing me to go just a little bit over. Thank you, Dr. Strothers.
Well, I do have a question. I wanted to ask you about the Pivot program. How many returning citizens have you guys been able to work with, and how many? What are some of the things that they've accomplished as a result?
Great question. So right now, Pivot is going into its third cohort. And so I don't know how many people they're taking this year, but their first year, we started with 20. We started with 20 out of a pool of around 90. Out of those 20, 15 graduated.
Oh, wow, great.
So 75% isn't, it's not all that we wanted.
Right.
And there's, and as I told my Pivot colleagues, you know, what business schools can do very well is tailor their programs to 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds or people that are coming, main time. Well, I don't want to say it that way, but you have to take what you're doing at the business school and tailor it to the needs of returning citizens. Mm-hmm. What may work on a Georgetown campus for a 23-year-old grad student may not actually be what's needed for the person coming home from prison. Mm-hmm. And so the challenges that we faced really had nothing to do with their capacity for academics or, you know, their passion and drive in the program. It was always all the things related to the challenges coming home. Like, for example, being arrested for being in a neighborhood that you live in or that you have ties to, and when they run your name and see that you're on parole, they arrest you anyway. And so we had to develop so we had to go and develop relationships that business schools normally don't develop relationships with. Number one, with HCUSA, which, you know, so we have now relationships with parole officers. So now what they've gotten to, I don't know if it was finalized yet, but we want to have one Pivot parole officer. You know, don't have 17 parole officers for 17 different people that we have to now develop relationships with. What if we could have one parole officer that knows the program, almost kind of like community policing to some extent, right? To where we're working with one person that we develop a relationship with, and that gets to know us and gets to know the fellows in the program and the work that we're trying to do. And so sometimes there's a disconnect between the program and also the other areas and, you know, the other agencies that are involved in working with our fellows. Number two is a lot of family dynamics. I'll highlight one success story that could have been the other way. Our friend Tyrone, he now works for the Justice Policy Institute. He was a juvenile lifer. So in DC, the laws changed a couple years ago. It's called I.R.E.A. I think it's Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, to where using the best science, knowing that people's brains don't fully develop until you're at least 25. And so they changed the law some years ago. I.R.E.A 1.0 was if somebody in the District of Columbia had been sentenced or the quote unquote crime had been committed, not so much when you went to prison, but when the crime was committed, if it was before your 18th birthday and you had completed at least 20 years of your sentence, you can petition the court to be released. And so then I.R.E.A 2.0 came out after that, where they said, well, now we're going to reduce it down if you've done 15 years. And so if we remember from the 90s, you know, we were giving 16, 17, and 15, 16, and 17-year-olds 100-something years in prison. And so Tyrone was given 120-something years in prison for a crime that was committed before his 18th birthday. He petitioned the court through I.R.E.A. He got out on a Wednesday. He was in Pivot on a Friday. He went in as a boy and came out as a 43-year-old man. And to walk from a prison, and imagine, you're thinking you're doing the rest of your life in prison. You've become a man so much in a prison, and you have no idea what it's like to be out in the world. You have no clue. It was difficult for me being 26 going in 2000 and coming out of 2011. I'd never used the internet. People are using smartphones. I remember wanting to run out of a McDonald's crying because the people were on Wi-Fi, and I consider myself a pretty put together dude. And so, and I had no idea what I was going to experience, right? So there's these expectations you have of what you think society is going to be like, and then when you get out, and then there's the reality. But also family members have no idea what it's going to be like when you get out.
That's true.
They don't know what it's going to, especially people that haven't been involved with the justice impacted system. People that are professionals and working. He had a sister who had clearance, who had government clearance, and she's afraid that she's going to lose her government clearance because they came in kicking in the door at 3 o'clock in the morning talking about, we need to search this home, and asking for information for her, like for her sister's information, like not just ID, but Social Security. I mean, the level of intrusiveness, right? So it's like these people are on parole as well. So the family members are experiencing, probably experiencing it worse.
Yes.
Because it's happening to you. It's not happening because of you. And so sometimes the family dynamics, we've watched people get kicked out of their homes because the relationships just break down. Anyway, so there's all those dynamics, but, and so we decided that we needed to partner, number one, with the McClendon Center to offer, counseling, targeted counseling services. We need to partner with a number of different agencies for wraparound services. So that being said, the good news, Tyrone today is a national figure that goes around the country working for the Justice Policy Institute. He was given, actually he got a job, I think he made more than me. Not even a year out of prison. Imagine that. He went from prison, it was in 3 days, he's in Georgetown. 9 months later, he's at the Justice Policy Institute. Others created businesses because we're a business incubator. Well, not we, I'm at Vera now, but so they have space at the Georgetown Venture Lab. So each fellow gets a space at the Georgetown Venture Lab, which is a business incubator for affiliated Georgetown members. It's at a WeWork on 14th and G. And so we have 3 businesses so far that were created. One was Odd Kicks, where somebody takes overstocked sneakers and customizes them. Another has a halal and vegan both catering service, and so that's where the incubator, but he doesn't have access to a commercial kitchen. So we're going to be looking to help him when we have our commercial kitchen, because there's a lot of contracts he can't take because he doesn't have a commercial kitchen. And so he creates great food, he just doesn't have access to the resources to be able to thrive and to scale his business. And then I don't know why I'm not thinking about the third, but other people have gone to work for a number of the agencies that hired them for interns, and others struggled. Others struggled. One had a daughter, one had a son who went to prison while she was in the program, and that threw her for a loop. And at the very end, it got difficult. Others struggled with family relationships and being kicked out of homes and losing relationships with children because of it. And that challenges them. And plus, even though they know that I'm formerly incarcerated, they look at, many times when you get out of prison, you look at authority, your relationship to authority figures is you see them as COs, as part of this system that's oppressing you. And so it's difficult to be vulnerable. For example, you're not going to walk up to a corrections officer and say, I'm really struggling emotionally. Do you think you can help me? It's just never going to happen. And so many times our fellows will like family members, will suffer in silence. And it's not until we prod and say, hey, listen, we're not a problem to solve. We're a resource to be used. And so that's some difficulties. But for the second cohort, a number of people have jobs at Link Strategies. I'm trying to think where other, one has like $130,000 job at some major corporation. I forgot where she went because I left before the second cohort finally ended. But right now, I think, I believe the last time I checked, because I had to put this together, I think we had an 80 or 85% either employment or business creation rate compared to the 50% unemployment rate in the city.
Great.
So our success rate is 85%, and we'd like it to be more. But I will say that with a 60% recidivism rate, we've only had really, if you want to, depending on how you count the statistics, no one has actually gone back to prison for a new crime in 3 years. And so they were supposed to have a conference this year that was going to roll out the model and see if other cities wanted to do it as well, and then have conversations with that. But obviously COVID hit, but be on the lookout for 2021 with it work for a national conference on Pivot at Georgetown.
Oh, awesome. Okay, you have another question. Ms. Jennifer.
Yes, hi, this is Jennifer Gore. I actually am the person who introduced you. I was so flustered with technical difficulties, I didn't introduce myself, so hello. I had a question. You mentioned how there is concern about people's returning citizens' understanding of authority and also their need for emotional support. Do you see any way churches could get involved, especially on that end? I'm just noticing that you have there are a lot of participants in Pivot, and I didn't hear too much about how local churches were involved in that, and actually if there's an opportunity for them to do that.
Yeah, that's critical. So for Pivot, professors do what they do. They're professors. They're not counselors. So that's one thing. And so we did partner with people like McClendon Center. I think we could have done it better. If I had stayed longer, I was trying to do, my role was going to switch from doing a lot of the day-to-day program management to doing more pastoral care. And so for me, I was already starting to reach out to other churches and to speak with pastors to see how we could develop. Because one of the things we had a mentoring program that really wasn't working as well. They were going to actually hand it to me, and so we tried to link people up with mentors that could serve as at least kind of like a first responder to help identify some of those challenges and then link them with services. And so I do think the church can play a major role. We do a lot of, especially pastors and our ministers, our deacons, do a lot of pastoral care and counseling to our congregants, and that we should tailor that to people who are coming home. The challenge is, though, is many times the type of pastoral care and counseling we do in a general context isn't always tailored to meet the needs of returning citizens. So I think one of the things churches can do is at least, well, one of the things we want to do is appoint someone, not just me, but others, that are kind of like a reentry coordinator, people that are just specifically learning about reentry issues, understanding the different challenges that people have, and then informing the rest of the congregation, right? And so, and that can be done in a number of ways. Number one, like partnering with healing communities and other agencies that are already doing this, having workshops and trainings with your prison and ministry team. Also, kind of like doing mock counseling sessions. That's another thing I want to do. How do you? It's one thing to hear. It's one thing to hear all these theories and how it's another thing to apply them, right? So giving a safe space for people to apply these concepts, I think that can help as well. But the church, many times, the church is kind of like the first responder situation for people coming home. And so, lastly, I would also say that if we have a prison ministry, we want to connect our prison ministry also with what we're doing in terms of reentry. I don't know your particular context, but many of the churches I've seen, they do one of two things. They either work on the inside or they do work on the outside. They don't do both. And so I think churches can come together. And that's where I think partnering. I've also noticed, I realize sometimes churches don't play nice. And that sometimes it's difficult working in collaboration. And so I think identifying, working with different churches, because not every church has every resource, but if we pool our resources, I've noticed working with a number of different churches, Church A has resource, can take care of issues A, B, and C. Church B can do C, D, and F, but both churches are trying to do everything. Right? So I think partnering as well. Hopefully that helps.
Well, thank you. That actually is a good answer. And you bring up a lot of things, especially the partnering aspect, that definitely will need more conversation, um, hopefully in the near future, because there's definitely a lot to be done. And clearly you're already handling a lot of it. So as we move forward, it would be great to learn more about the other opportunities. Are there any more questions?
I would have one more point. Many times people in prison we have a complete lack of invulnerability, of vulnerability, right? Like most people from prison aren't going to come out and say, hey, listen, I'm struggling emotionally, I'm struggling psychologically. Like nobody wants to just name that, because in prison, that's looked at as a weakness, and weakness means you can be preyed upon, and nobody wants to be looked at weak because you can have a really hard, you don't want to, there's a fear that something's going to happen to you, even though nobody wants to name it. And so I think we can be intentional about having conversations with people that we know and ask the probing questions, help to name. I did this last year. Many times the family members and people coming home don't know how to name the challenges that they're facing. And that's what I think academics do, right? We give descriptions, we come up with categories, we come up with theories that kind of name reality. And so I would recommend Keisha Middlemass's book, Convicted and Condemned, The Policies and Practices. She's a good Howard professor that kind of tries to give some labels using social disability theory to identify some of the challenges, but asking guided questions is what we do in many times in counseling anyway, right? We help people come to their own realization, come to their own conclusions, and really being proactive and saying, hey, listen, what's going on psychologically? How are you doing? And kind of naming some of those things. How's the psychological transition going? How do you feel in the world? Asking those types of questions, because I felt like I did not belong. And I've talked to hundreds of people and they said the same thing. You feel like you're on another planet when you get out of prison, and that everybody knows it. And so I used to force myself to go into healthy, uncomfortable spaces until they felt comfortable.
Yeah, those are excellent points, because, of course, you can't really solve a problem until you can name it. And
Exactly.
just having that language, most people aren't. I know you say that there's a lack of vulnerability. Of course, it's required to survive prison and incarceration of any type, but most people walking around on the outside aren't using that language either. So there's definitely space to grow in that regard. I think that this has been an excellent presentation. I hope that we get to do more with you and along this vein. And we just really thank you for your time. I really want to see, because we've gone over time, I'm really just trying to see if there are any more questions. Excuse me, any more questions or comments? And we definitely thank you for what you've presented, because there's a lot to chew on.
Yes.
My pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you.